we're going to talk not about technology itself, but about the ways in which living in a technologized world has changed us all. I'll leave that tantalizing sentence dangling in the air and ask you all to look around us. And 2.5 years or whatever your number is into the COVID-19 era. Okay, so we've gotten used to that, right? Remember when we used to say, oh, this is so new, it's so novel, it's crazy. Now it's at best, okay, one more way of doing things. But how different is it than everything we're used to doing for most of our lives? My mind today is on, my mind right now is in this room, but after this is over and before this, part of my mind is at the conference that is taking place now that I'm not at. It's an in-person conference, I'm not there. So my mind now is divided between sort of two different modes of being together. We really got used to this way of being together pretty quickly. In fact, we got so used to it that we got really tired of it and annoyed of it very early on in the pandemic. And all of the expressions of Zoom fatigue and not another online meeting that could have been an email. And I think that sort of boredom is a sign of how quickly we've moved past the initial stage. Clay Shirky from NYU has a sentence that he says about technology. He says, communication skills don't get socially interesting until they get technologically boring. And think about how technologically boring Zoom has become by now, and some of these other things have become by now. And now we're in the socially interesting phase. And one of the things that I find socially interesting is a lot of my colleagues over the past few months have mentioned in different types of talks that they've either been asked to move to a different platform for interacting with one another, or that other people have invited them to meetings on which they were on other platforms. There's a move in the US particularly to conduct meetings on Teams rather than on Zoom for financial reasons. And everybody is talking about how they dislike it, they prefer Zoom, they don't want to go to Teams. Teams isn't as good. That a lot of conversations about that, or maybe it's just stuff people speak with me about, thinking that I am for some people, I am something of the face of technological stuff. So either they complain to me or express to me, but I also experience it. I don't enjoy it either. I don't like Teams either. So I asked myself, isn't this weird? Just 3 years ago, 2 years ago, we were complaining about the need to be on Zoom, the need to move to Zoom. And here we are now defending Zoom because we don't want to move to something else. And as I always said 5 years ago, 10 years ago, before any of this was a dream for many people, I suggested that it's not technology that bothers us, it's change. And I think that is all replaying itself in the Zoom Teams drama or whatever it is. If you haven't had it yet, you'll have it at some point moving to a different place. We just have a reaction to change. And particularly there are connections between change and technology, but change in itself is an issue, not just technological change. That's a somewhat vague forward, but it might speak to some of you. And it's important nowadays to remember the notion, just because we think, oh, everything's changed, now everything is different from how it was 3 years ago. Okay, so now we have this new normal, whatever it is, to get used to, and then we'll be all right once we get used to it. That's not how change works. So today I'd like to talk about the notion of change and its impact on humans, because if there's any constant about change, it's that it keeps on happening. Sometimes it happens slowly over the course of slow evolutionary history, and sometimes it happens in a heartbeat. Let's talk about it happening in a heartbeat for a moment. It happened in a heartbeat for the mediation and conflict field. A colleague of mine from New York, Nikki Borowski, made up this infographic style visual. She called it the 5 stages of virtual ADR, but it's true for so many things. Remember yourself early on, or let's say in 2010, 2015, if anybody mentioned the notion of can we mediate, negotiate, do things online, and think about those 5 stages that you went through, and the most powerful one was the denial stage. This stuff can't be done, it'll never be done. And then we went through all the other stages, these stages of, that are parallel to the 5 stages of grief. And the interesting thing about this is that that first stage lasted for so long, that first stage of denial. The notion of negotiating and mediating online has been around since the mid-90s, but it was deemed to be just sort of the territory of a bunch of kooky people working in their mother's garages or something like that. And it was something that we could never do or would prefer not to do, or, we'd have to be dragged kicking and screaming into doing it. And that was the story of 1996 to 2020. And then in 2020, and here I have the date, March 15th, which is more or less, give or take a week, the date at which COVID-19 started to be a real thing in the United States. Put it a month earlier or a month and a half earlier if you're in Europe, you know your date of the locale that you're in, you know your date. And then in that next month, and these are the dates in the United States, we went through all of the other stages. And here we are now at the other side of that, where all of the discussion nowadays, when people talk about the future, people talk about the new normal, what's it going to be, and inevitably talk about the question of, will this technologically dominated landscape of activity, will it continue? And to what extent will it continue? And of course, the conversation is different in different places. There are different actors, there are different players, there are different attitudes towards it. But most of the conversations are either about that or about one other thing. In other words, even before you start looking towards the future, I noticed early on during the COVID-19 period that when people got together to talk about conflict resolution and mediation in the current day, they tended to speak about one thing and one thing only. It shouldn't be surprising. We were all part of those conversations. And I turned it into a law. Like I always wanted there to be a law of, like a law of physics, right? Like Einstein's second law of something. But I work in the softer sciences, and we don't have hard and fast laws, let's say in the social science. So, so what could Ebner's law be? And I came up with the law that in the COVID-19 era, the longer 2 mediators spoke about mediation, the likelihood that they will start to talk about Zoom settings approaches 1. Because that's how we are. When we speak about processes, we often get lost in the technical bells and whistles, or the technical buttons, the settings. How do you set up breakout rooms? Do you prefer to use this type of background, virtual background, or not? And many mediator conversations would very quickly evolve or devolve, based on how you're looking at it, into that. That's what we were talking about for so long. And I would suggest that at this point, first of all, because we know many of the answers to that already. And second of all, because those aren't really the important questions. At this point, we can zoom out and look at other things. And here I have a picture of, for all the Star Wars fans out there, of Princess General Leia Organa telling her best pilot to get his head out of the cockpit. I'm working on a book on Star Wars and conflict resolution. So my entire world of references tends to go in that direction. I can't help but say, check it out at starwarsandconflictresolution.com. But once I've said that once, I can move on and say that I think that we're all in that place, that we tend to get our head narrowed, focused in the cockpit. We're looking at the buttons. We're trying to make sure that we do things right on Zoom, trying to make sure that we can follow the shared screen, the chat, the video windows, that we haven't muted ourselves by mistake, or that people who should be muted aren't muted. And when we're so focused inside the cockpit, so to speak, we don't see outside. And I'd like us today to focus on the world outside, and particularly our changing world. And of course, change is a human constant, but we live in a generation of unprecedented change, both in quantity and in pace. And it sounds almost banal to speak about that today. I'll pin it down to specific things. I'll share that my own story. I have been sort of living and working and relating across at least 2, sometimes 3 countries for all of my professional career. And much of that has been done with technology. I've been teaching online for the past nearly 20 years by now, exclusively so for nearly 15. The technological aspect of that has been a large part of my life. But along the way, I noticed that the change that I was noticing is not just technology is changing, but that change is happening in non-technological areas as a result of technology. One aspect of that has to do directly with conflict, that there is more conflict and sharper conflict. I mean, we all know about internet flame wars and about how easy it is to get angry at someone because they sent you a text that that didn't express well what they intended, and we read it and got really angry. So there's more conflict and sharp conflict. We have more people talking to one another than ever before, and more prone to get angry at each other than ever before. But it's not only that, it's also that we have new types of conflict. We have different conflict, and we'll touch on that as we go along. It's not just that people fight online and that people fight online differently. It's that we have more conflict and sharper conflict in all of our world. A second area of change is change in myself. I recognize that I was changing, and this change isn't only sort of in how I do things, and it's also not how I change when I'm online. It's that I've changed in general. And finally, the time at which I really put this into words was when attending a negotiation conference. And the reason to convene the conference was that many people were thinking that negotiation theory seemed to be somewhat at odds with itself. And it seemed to not quite provide answers to the practical questions that people had. And when you look at it and it's inconsistent with itself, what might be the cause to that? And there were many suggestions offered, and I'm not suggesting that mine is necessarily the best. But the suggestion that I made is that the reason that negotiation theory seems to be inconsistent with itself and sometimes at odds with itself is that people are changing. And I don't just mean, let's say, in the way that we change as we grow older, or in the sense that, from one generation to another, people are different. We like different music, right? We get angry at the younger generation's music, just as our parents got angry at our music. That's not the kind of change that I'm talking about. But rather, my suggestion is that there is a rapid change process happening in people, inside us, in what it is to be human, in our beingness. And this change is driven, perhaps amongst other reasons, but it's driven as a result of being immersed in a highly technological reality, a highly technological state of being, a highly technological society, 24/7, 365 and a quarter. To different extents, all of our experiences are different, but sort of I think it's safe to say that around, I'll carefully say, most of the world, our societies have technologized to an extent and at a pace never known before to humankind. And I'm suggesting that that has changed us And when I say changed us, what do I mean? So there's a lot of humor that can be used to describe this, okay? And we can tell jokes. Often it's about how people have changed over the course of the past X years, or how people have changed throughout the course of evolution. Notice how in these satirical sort of cartoons or drawings, technology is in the background of all this. Technology is recognized as a driver. And the fact that humans respond to technology deep inside, have a response, a visceral and internal, a psychological response to technology, is a general human truism. I'm generally not the type of person who reads his PowerPoint slides out loud, so I'll just leave you with this quote from the master, and let you consider for a moment whether this speaks to you. And it's important to note that Douglas Adams isn't talking about the job market. He's talking about humans and their response to technology, and also their response to change. And when I went out to look, wait, so is anybody talking about humans? Are humans changing as a result of technology? Looking in fields outside of negotiation, I found that, yeah, it's well documented, and it's increasingly well documented that people are not only changing in their behaviors, that we all know, but they're changing. Sorry, I was once guided by a wise mentor that when I'm speaking about people and humans, it's best not to use the term they. It would be much more, to use the term we. And I am taking that to heart. So we are changing on the psychological plane. We're changing on the plane of cognition. We're changing physically, and we're changing in our interactions. And I will very quickly show some of those. But of course, before I show some of those, I'd like to just remind you what we're here for. Of course, all of these areas of being human have a lot to do with negotiation and conflict. Now, my first insights into this, as I said earlier, were in the realm of negotiation, and I'm broadening it to the field of conflict. So if I say negotiation, feel free to zoom out and consider non-negotiation settings. Just look at this and see if this speaks to you. These are some of our behavioral changes. The degree to which you've changed any of these somewhat depends on the culture you're in, but mainly it depends on when you were born and how quickly you adopted technology. Also, we each have a different evolution with technology, particularly on the behavioral plane. And I'd suggest that there's probably many of you do many of these things, have had many changes in this realm, and now do many of these things online. I'd also suggest that many of you have at least one thing on this list that you refuse to do online, and that's also interesting. But the behavioral level is the easiest to identify. But let's think about this guy, and let's be this guy for a moment. And I'd like you to consider your internal response to this. That sort of oh no. And it's not because, oh, I'm about to do a lot of damage. It's about the kind of damage I'm about to do. It's because when I look at this picture, so after my first knee-jerk response, I say, oh wow, I'd rather spill that coffee in my lap than spill it on my laptop. And that might give you an inkling over what's going on here. And the same is like, what's your visceral response? For me, this happened several times when my kids decided that they wanted to throw my cell phone into the toilet. And this is my cell phone, or my generic cell phone, sitting in a bowl of rice, in that Schrodinger's cat state of, I don't know whether this will be all right once I take it out of the rice. And what are my concerns and my worries? It's not, oh no, a new phone is going to cost me $300, $500. That's not the concern. It's, oh no, I live my life on there. Oh no, for me, my laptop is half of my brain. And yes, it is half of my brain. And I think that we are much closer to being cyborgs half human or part human, part machine interface than we like to admit. The fact that we carry our semi-brain around in our pocket, separated from our skin by a millimeter of cloth, is not really that big of a difference from having it implanted into us. But, I'm not going to push the cyborg agenda, but I will say that other ways in which we've changed psychologically and physiologically, I'll ask you, have you ever felt your phone ringing, vibrating, telling you that there was a message, and then you took your phone out and looked at it and you discovered that there was no message? And then your instinct was not to say, oh, my mistake, but to say, no, but where is it? I know that I felt it. And if that's ever happened to you, then you've experienced what a very common tendency, I think most of us, perhaps all of us, but I'm not going to say that, have experienced. It's called phantom vibration syndrome, in which our body physically straining our nerves and our nerve endings, physically straining towards our phone, identify some vibration in the air and notify us that we've received a message, that you have mail going on in our heads. And that's even though technology is not yet connected to us. That is psychological and physiological change. And here's the best example of physiological change. And physiological change is the most important to consider because it brings it home. Because when I say change is happening, it's easy to think about that sort of in a general, vague, detached way. But what I'm going to suggest now is that, no, this hits much closer to home. Your brain has changed over the past 20 years in a way that it has not changed in all of human existence. One easy way to discuss this is if you use Waze or Google Maps or navigate different ways, different GPS systems. If you rely on these, then your brain is not developing the part of the brain that has developed over millennia to help humans get around. It's a part of the brain. It's a physical lump, whatever the size of it, it's a physical lump in your brain. When you use it, it grows. Okay, people who have to drive taxis around London have larger brains, larger brain areas to deal with that. And people who use GPS have smaller brain areas. A same one, this is for the older amongst you perhaps, is think about how many phone numbers you remembered by heart when you were a child. You knew yours, you knew your home number, maybe your parents, your family, friends. I don't know whether your number is 10, 20, 50. But now ask yourself, how many do you remember now? How many phone numbers do you remember? And you're very welcome to type that in the chat if you'd like, because I think it would be not only amusing but recognizing that we have changed. I remember perhaps 5 numbers, and the reason I remember 5 numbers is because I have offloaded this task to my phone. My phone remembers all of my numbers for me, and in this act. Thank you for everybody who's adding that in. In this act of what's called cognitive offloading, we take things that we used to process cognitively and we hand them over to technology. We tell our brain, listen, don't waste space on that. Dedicate that space to other stuff. And the brain dedicates the space to other stuff and physically rewires our brain to be more efficient because it doesn't need that area to be active. And inside our minds over the past generation, or for the more important part, over the course of our own individual past 5, 10, 15, 20 years, our brain has been reforming itself. Okay? So again, for all those who thought that we're speaking about external change ideas, nope. We are physically changing. And Paul, I'll just comment, Paul commented that he knows his own mobile number and his own childhood home number. And I think that that's also a wonderful description of sort of how the brain is what parts of the brain is it rewiring. Sure, yes, I can remember the phone number, my phone number in Manhattan at the age of 5. I cannot remember my father's phone number. Okay, long-term memory, short-term memory, but we're not talking short-term memory. We're talking, a phone that he's had for the past 20 years. I can't remember it. Okay. So if our brain is changing, I think I don't even need, I hardly need to go over this list of all the interactional changes that we have experienced over the past, again, whatever your personal evolution is, whether it's 5, 10, 20 years. But all of this is true, and it's true in our face-to-face engagements and interactions, just as it is true with our online. It's popular now to talk about, well, everything's changed because we're always online. And I'm suggesting that's only half the picture. Everything's changed online and offline. And we've changed online and offline. So here's the thing. When I brought these suggestions, of course, reading this research in the realms of psychology, in the realms of medicine, in the realms of neuroplasticity, it occurred to me to think, wait, if people are changing and, negotiators are people too, then, simple geometrical equations would lead you to sort of the conclusions that we reach, that we are changing in this interaction that we call negotiation. We are changing as negotiators. We are changing as conflict parties. And as we change, the processes themselves are changing as well. And it occurred to me, bringing this back to the original insight, that might explain why different things are being said about negotiation, in that case specifically, because perhaps what is not being taken into account is this people are changing. So it makes perfect sense that some of what's written would be incongruent with itself. But here's the thing. When I went looking in the negotiation world and in the conflict resolution world for discussion of human change, this is what there was. This is an Americanism. I apologize. Crickets means silence, and you can hear the crickets chirping in the background. Nothing. There is nothing written on it. In other words, there's an assumption in the negotiation and conflict resolution world that everything is as it once was. Sure, there's technology, so sometimes you need to be careful about how we do things, on technology, but generally speaking, the humans described in Getting to Yes, let's say, a book that perhaps many of you have read, the humans described in Getting to Yes and how they do things and how they should do things are the humans here in the room together today. We're the same. And the same goes for people as not only as parties to negotiation, but as parties to conflict, people as conflict resolvers, people as parties, and therefore for the processes themselves, negotiation, mediation, what was, is. And here, when I suggest this, very often people say, wait, but we are changing. I mean, we've been talking for the past 3 years about online negotiation. So we are recognizing that things change. We are recognizing that there is technological change in the air, and it's not, and things that happen online are different than what happens when we're face to face, and we need to adapt. And I say, yeah, that's true, but what that is a smokescreen. We look at technology as something instrumental. How do we use technology? But what we don't look is how has living with technology changed us. And so much of the literature that does deal, and maybe trainings that you've done over the past couple of years about how to deal with technology, what we usually do is we try to flatten technology's effects. Technology has mainly bad effects, so goes the party line sort of, on negotiation and mediation. Not all, but largely negative effects. And what we need to do is sort of to push back against technology by using this technique or pushing that button or keeping this in mind. And we can bring online stuff back to be as similar to face-to-face stuff as possible. And if there's any change in the world, it's that people are different when they're online. They're more conflict prone, they're less cooperative, and they tend to flame, issue ultimatums, and et cetera, et cetera. The people are generally the same unless they're online, and that's what I call a smokescreen. And it's a smokescreen because long ago, very long ago, in the 50s and the 60s, as technology started to enter the household, people have been talking about this. And this is a quote from Marshall McLuhan, who many of you know from what he said, that the media is the message. And when he said the media, the message, what he meant to say is, and this is the part that I will read, our conventional response to all media. He was writing about TV and other such media, and I'm saying it about email, Zoom, and everything else, is that it is how they are used that counts, is the numb stance of the technological idiot. Now listen, I had read McLuhan long ago and not so long ago, and then again. And each time I had read that and nodded and said, oh, I get it. And then I realized at some point when I was re-looking at this and looking where in the conflict resolution field we deal for this, I said to myself, Noam, you idiot, he's talking to you, he's talking about you. And realizing ruefully that that I really was the technological idiot he was talking about. If you Google my work or some of my work, you'll find that I have dedicated so many hours to writing about just that, about how they are used. I've written about negotiation via email, about negotiation via text messaging, negotiation via video conferencing, negotiation via X, Y, and Z, and about developing trust when we're via, and all sorts of flattening things to get the most out of your via technology. But not recognizing that it's not how technology is used that counts, but it's what technology does to us that counts. That's when that's when I recognize that I really am that numb technological idiot he was discussing. And the article I wrote in which I owned up to that and articulated some of the things I'm talking about it today, you're welcome to read it. I warn you, it's a long one. They didn't give me a word limit and I just had so much to say. So, skim. I had wanted to write this about a follow-up about how not only is negotiation changing, but also mediation is changing, and more deeply, that conflict is changing. I have not yet written the other two, and I would be delighted if anyone would write them before I did. So see this as an invitation. Because once you start looking for this kind of change, it's everywhere. You start seeing it everywhere. And once you start seeing it everywhere, you can take it and apply it to what you know about negotiation or conflict or mediation, and you start seeing it. Like you've blown away the smokescreen. And let me give you an example. Let's take an example of the notion of empathy. Okay, so we all know that empathy is, it's gold. It's negotiator gold. It's mediator gold. It facilitates all of those things that are listed there. We really need to work well with empathy. And if you read the literature, the psychological literature mainly, but also the neurochemistry literature, you realize that people are changing with regard to empathy, with their ability to recognize what's happening with the other, with their ability to recognize and understand what the other is saying, whether verbally or non-verbally, our ability to read people's body language, our own body language is changing again. And I'm not talking about when we're online, I'm talking about when we're in the room and online. But let's focus on in the room because that's the revolutionary part of this. There's a lot of literature about what the impact of video games is on. And I think that's very telling because it's always convenient to point at a younger generation and say, yeah, technology is changing them. Believe me, there's someone older than you who's pointing at you and saying technology has changed you. So when you do find yourself pointing at your younger generation, I have four I have 4 children, and they are each a different technological generation. So it was easy at first to notice how people are changing with response to technology by looking at my children. But of course, it has changed me as well. It's also changed my parents. This is not an age-dependent thing. It's easiest to identify looking down, but that's just a matter of convenience. So there's a lot of literature about what the effects are on empathy about children playing violent video games. And interestingly, it's not quite as clear-cut as we might instinctively think, but there is a lot of research about it. There's also research about what is the effect of children playing pro-social video games, cooperative video games, just to say that this isn't all negative. It can also be intentionally positive, but the important thing is that it changes us. And here's another area, and again, just very quickly, that's key to negotiation and key to conflict resolution. And if we notice, you just think back over the past 5-7 years and think about things that have changed our trust wiring, whether you view our trust wiring as something physical or as something psychological. And my answer to you is, it's both, but work with this as you want. But this trust, which is considered key, essential to negotiation and to conflict resolution, is changing. I'll just as an example for how you have changed with trust. Remember that when if you would have an anniversary and you wanted to go to a restaurant at which you knew you would have a really good time right? You would ask around and ask your close social network and people you trusted and who knew your tastes, you would ask them what would be a good restaurant. And now many of us go on the internet and ask a bunch of total strangers. And we ask a bunch of total strangers, even though we know that many of these reviews are fake reviews in the first place, either with a positive or a negative bone to pick with the restaurant. But still, that's what we do. And we trust it, and we trust the relationship of that we are celebrating its anniversary. We entrust it to that group of nameless, faceless strangers out into the internet. So that's only one example of how trust is changing. And here's the thing. If negotiation and mediation models are a system, everything you change changes everything. So if trust is changing, negotiation is changing. Of course, that's a strong sentence, okay? And I'm inviting you to think about it for yourself. It's not true just because I say so. But for those of you with a systems view of how this works, you can't help but think, wait, so if some of these key elements are changing, then the whole thing has to change. Choose your favorite element of getting to yes and consider how it's changed, and then consider, wait, so what does that mean about the entire model? And that's sort of a helpful exercise to do. The second thing is, if the players change, then the process changes. And that I've sort of foreshadowed, and I'll say it again. If we're changing as negotiators, if our processing is different, our trusting is different, our empathy is different, and other issues that are discussed in the article, and other issues which I hope you're thinking about now that are not discussed in the article, because the article is just examples. We don't know yet where and what we've changed about. But if all these are changing, then we're changing in the way we negotiate, we're changing in the way we mediate, our parties in the mediation room are changing in the way they party, and our parties and the parties who aren't in the mediation room, parties to conflict, are changing in the way that we fight each other. Now, here's the thing, and I'll toss this out and then I'll stop. I could go on for a while, as you might be guessing. Change happens, and then it happens again. And what I'd like to suggest is we're sort of we've peaked. I've seen this peak of certainly technological, including societal change. Some of it to do with technology, some of it to do with other things. And we've changed as humans as a result. And I suggest we're just getting started. And if anything, the COVID period has just been has just been an accelerator for this change. Think about the amount of technological immersion that you now have over the past couple of years that you hadn't had 5 years ago. Even if 5 years ago you thought you were spending all day on your computer, that's nothing compared to the past couple of years. There's so much technological innovation that has happened in the past couple of years. There's so much technological adoption on a personal and societal level. This is a McKinsey report that was, look at the date, May 14th. This is 2-3 months into COVID. Is that consumers, business, society has jumped forward technologically 5 years in 2 months. This is old news. This is 2 years ago. And I won't get into this, but there are reasons to believe that the pace of change isn't slowing down, but it's accelerating. I explain some of that in the article, and I'll also leave that to think about your own lives. So thinking about that, the last thoughts that I'll give you is relate specifically to conflict, not necessarily to negotiation. But when you think about some of these things that you might have noticed in you or around you over the past 5 years, particularly over the past 2 years. Some of these weren't around when I was writing the original article, and some of them had begun to be around and we thought they were as bad as they could be, but they weren't. But these are just ways in which humans are changing. And I wonder what else is that should be on this list. So let me turn this over to you. And my question to you generally, which you can answer now, or you can take home and think about it, is how am I changing? And if I am changing, how does that affect, how would that affect a process that I'm a part of? Whether it's a negotiation process or a fight or a mediation that I'm mediating, and think of yourself either whether you're being mediated or in the mediator role. How would that affect how that process goes? We're not even ready yet fully for the question of, so what do I need to do to adapt the process in order to cope with that? Let's leave that for now. First, let's just stay at the level of how am I changing, or what that might mean about me when I'm in a process. And I'll leave you with that. And of course, feel free to comment, ask, or just go off on diatribes on your own that don't have anything to do with that question. Over to you. Thank you, everybody.